What you're about to hear is part one in a 6-part series on the 2022 film Aftersun. Aftersun is an incredible movie. It's centered in a father-daughter relationship, but it's really also about the psychology of memory. What is memory? How and why do we remember or forget? And how does memory tie into not just our personal lives, but also our larger human stories and histories? Narratives, beginnings and endings, shadows, reflections, and mirrors. All big themes here, as you know. So if you like this one, you can get the rest on my Patreon page at patreon.com/reflectinghistory. The link for that is in the show notes. Even if you don't pay a visit there, you should give Aftersun a watch. Again, an amazing movie, and I think you'll like it, and I hope you enjoy the series. I want you to think about memory through the analogy of a puzzle. For most of us, really all of us, when we look back at the past, we don't see a continuous play-by-play of events. We don't remember a completely accurate, shot-for-shot recreation of reality as it actually happened. Instead, we see an incomplete puzzle. The puzzle is enormous, maybe infinite, and there may be pieces missing forever. There may be pieces that exist just outside our awareness. There may be pieces right in front of us that we grab at only to watch them dissolve. Sometimes the pieces that we put together end up falling apart over time. But sometimes those pieces that we do put together stick and they become powerful. Why is that? What is memory? How do memories form? Why do they fade? Why do certain memories stick with us through years and traumas and changes? I'm sure we can all remember something, those vivid memories that help make us who we are, especially in childhood. Maybe a view looking out a window, a comment to a friend that you regret, a silly moment at a birthday party, a feeling at a sporting event. What is it about these memories that make them stick in our mind, even if the larger puzzle of these memories is missing pieces or is incomplete? And what if we really needed to find those missing pieces to put together the true puzzle of memory? How do we gain access to the past in our minds? When you think about that for a second, that would be an incredible power to unlock this puzzle of memory. The 2022 film Aftersun opens with the nostalgic analog sounds of an old-fashioned camcorder. We as the audience are vaguely introduced to Sophie, our main character, who is watching what we can guess to be footage of her from her childhood. We see this footage of Sophie waving and then some footage of her and her dad. Later on, we find out that her dad's name is Callum. And in the footage that we are watching, Sophie asks Callum, quote, "When you were 11, what did you think you would be doing now?" End quote. And with that question, we are immediately introduced to one of the main themes of this movie, the puzzle of memory and this idea of looking back into the past. And in this case, we have a sort of double look back. Sophie as an adult is looking back, watching film of Sophie as a child, who is asking her dad to look back at his childhood and think about how his life has turned out. Callum pauses a bit, and immediately after that, we as the audience again are thrown into this disorienting, confusing, and anxiety-inducing rave scene. So there's music and lights flashing and people all over the place, and it's chaotic, and the rave is mixed with hazy and jumbled camera footage from the camcorder. So as the old footage of Sophie and Callum is playing, and the older version of Sophie is watching back on that footage, those clips are getting mixed in with this bizarre rave scene. And through the disorienting rave, we get the feeling that adult Sophie is looking for Callum. And both may be mystified and perplexed a little bit. We then get a final shot of childhood Sophie in the camcorder footage waving goodbye. To who or why or where she is going is left unanswered for the moment, but upon rewatching the film, these answers are immediately obvious. And it's only in hindsight that those answers become clear. Maybe just like memory, only by looking back at the past do we establish and apply meaning to our lives. Attempting to piece together the puzzle of memory is an integral part to all of our inner lives, even if that puzzle may be infinite and ultimately unsolvable. So right away, we're introduced to the basic premise of the film, and it's a simple concept, but beautifully executed here in Aftersun. And because of the complexity of memory as a topic, it makes for a very fun and complicated movie that you can watch back a number of times and continue to enjoy it, at least in my view. Basically, the film centers around Sophie as an adult, looking back on her past as a child and watching this camcorder tape footage of a vacation that she took with her dad many years ago. Sophie has no concrete data outside of the tape, no continuous footage of memory to access in her mind. Instead, she has to rely on the camcorder footage and the puzzle of memory. We, as the audience, are seeing this recreation that she's making in her head as an attempt to piece together this vacation that she took with her dad. And this recreation from her memory is essentially the movie that we're watching. Now, before we get too deep into the movie here, I think it's worth talking a little bit about the psychology of memory, and it might be worth getting on the same page with how memory actually works. So, first of all, there's a couple of different types of memory. First, we have short-term memory, which is closely related to what we call sensory memory. And this is basically just your experience of the world, and it might also be described as the self. So inputs from the environment come into your body through your senses, smells, sights, sounds, etc. And immediately these sensations begin to get filtered into things that mean something by your brain. Attention. What are you paying attention to? Perception. How are you perceiving the things that you're sensing and paying attention to? So this short-term memory is working with our sensations and being able to quickly recall things on the spot, or even to recall those things after a short amount of time. We call this working memory. What do you immediately have access to? And this is impacted and biased by things like the primacy effect and the recency effect. The primacy effect being that we tend to like the beginning of things, and we tend to remember the beginning of things. And the recency effect being that we tend to remember the end more than anything else. So in other words, we don't really remember the middle of things very well. We remember the beginning and the end. And sometimes we obsess over them. Think about stories and narratives, beginnings and endings. More on that later. But anyway, in addition to short-term memory, we also have long-term memory. And this is probably what most of us mean when we talk about memory. And there's a subconscious level to this. Memories are always with us, along for the ride in everything that we do. Every now and then, they come up to the surface when we recall them at the conscious level. Sometimes these memories boost us forward on our journey in a positive way. Sometimes they haunt us and prevent us from going where we want to go, even if they do contain so much of who we are. Psychologist Paul Bloom talks about short-term memory and long-term memory, and in his book Psych, he says, quote, "The most obvious way in which long-term memory and short-term memory differ is in capacity. We've seen that short-term memory is sharply limited. Long-term memory, however, has virtually unlimited storage. Every word you know is in long-term memory. Every face you recognize, every story, every joke, every victory, and every humiliation. They are all in the long-term memory. Now, long-term memory has to have some limit. It is encoded in the physical brain, and brains are finite things. It would be neat to compare its capacity to that of computers, but estimates should not be trusted because we know so little about how the brain encodes information. Still, some brave souls have taken a shot at it, and one estimate is that long-term memory is 2.5 petabytes, about 1 million gigabytes. If you had a computer with that much memory, you could hold 3 million hours of video. End quote. We have a nice explanation of short-term and long-term memory there from psychologist Paul Bloom, but sometimes good explanations lead to even more questions. And if memory is so central and so expansive, the question becomes, how do we remember? And why do we remember? A Psychology 101 student at your local university might attempt to answer this question by going on about the portions of the brain and neurons firing from different parts of the brain, and they might identify brain parts responsible for memory, like the hippocampus and the amygdala, and so on. But none of that physical stuff really helps us understand memory all that much. The parts of the brain can't tell us why we remember some things and not remember other things. The hard problem of consciousness, right? One of the great mysteries in all of science. And we haven't figured that one out yet. What we do know is that there are some factors that can help us explain how and why we remember things. Sometimes it's unconscious and unexplainable, but sometimes there is depth of processing that helps memory. So basically, how deeply we delve into something affects how much we remember of it. Makes sense, right? The vividness of an experience can also affect memory. So vividness could mean the level of importance that you assign to something, the level of interest that you assign something, and how bright and clear an event is could affect how well you remember it. And I would probably extend this idea of vividness to include emotions and feelings. The more you feel something, the more likely you are to remember it. Although what's interesting is that those very same feelings that contribute to the vividness of a memory may also cloud your perception of what is happening to you. And that can happen in the moment, and that can happen weeks, months, or years down the line. Another factor that may affect memory is sleep and dreams. These may function as ways to consolidate memory, freeze it in place once it happens. Another idea is that there are what we call retrieval cues similar to memory itself that may assist in remembering things. The idea is that if you are doing something similar to the original memory or feeling the same way that you did when the memory is formed, you may be more likely to remember what you're trying to remember. So in this particular movie, think about Sophie watching the camera footage. She's trying to put herself in the frame of mind that she was in on that vacation and hope that she might remember some things about her dad. And she's hoping that this original footage from the camcorder may help spur those memories. And she's right about that. But speaking of the camcorder that plays a central role in the film, memory is not a camcorder. And I think this movie depicts that very well, unlike a lot of movies that are about memory. So in the movie, even though Sophie has that footage, it's just a tool. It's broken up and it's incomplete and it doesn't paint the whole picture. And every time you retrieve the memory and imprint a interpretation on top of that memory, you slightly change the memory itself. Sometimes we lose memories altogether. Sometimes there was nothing there to begin with, and sometimes there was just a trace. Just like Sophie doesn't have a complete recording of the whole vacation, our brains don't have full recordings of our day. And even if they did, our memories would still be tainted by things like primacy and recency and vividness and sensation and perception and bias and recollection. Here is psychologist Paul Bloom again on this phenomenon. He says, quote, "Memory is not a recording that you can go back to whenever you are properly motivated. Sometimes what you experienced, including what was once right in front of your face, is never attended to and so is lost forever. Sometimes the memory is stored but then forgotten. Memories are encoded in brains, and brains are physical things, and so there is degradation over time. Sometimes the memory persists, but it's hard to find. In such cases, we might benefit from searching strategies. We've all had the experience of struggling to remember something, everything from the name of an actor on a television show to where we put our car keys, trying to approach the memory from different directions, thinking about what other shows was she in, what did I first do when I returned to the house last night, and then the answer pops into our heads. It's as if memories leave tendrils, and if you grab hold of one of the tendrils, you can trace your way back to the source. But often, you'll never get there." End quote. I would add on here, crucially, that when grasping onto these tendrils, oftentimes we fill in details or we create plausible stories to allow us to grab onto those tendrils, even if these new manufactured stories never happened, or they happened in a slightly different way from the original events as they once were. So because of all of that, I think it's useful to think about memory as a process rather than a thing that is set in stone. Not so coincidentally, I think it's useful to think of history that way as well. But memory is a process like a circle or a carousel. Input, sensation, attention, retrieval, recall, storage, recall, retrieval, attention, sensation, input. It's all a cycle, and it all plays back on the parts before and after. And it's no surprise that as this carousel turns, some memories fall off and other stories hop along for the ride. Back to Aftersun now. This brings us to one of my favorite theories about this movie, which is that anything that's not directly on the camera footage that Sophie is watching as an adult is susceptible to the trappings of this puzzle of memory. Again, a piece may be missing or out of reach or distorted, and what we are seeing and what Sophie is seeing may not be an entirely perfectly recreated vision of reality. So just like with real memory, there's a way to interpret this film through the following idea. And that idea is that anything not in Sophie's direct experience is something that should be viewed with suspicion as a potential distortion of memory. That doesn't mean necessarily that whatever that memory is a fabrication. That's just how memory works. To me, this makes this particular movie very fun to rewatch because there is this way that you can constantly question what is happening as you're watching. So that may be something to keep in mind as we talk through the different scenes of the movie and the different themes, and especially the scenes that aren't in the camcorder or scenes that Callum doesn't directly experience with Sophie. There is this way to view the movie where those scenes are potentially Sophie's imagining of how it all went down rather than necessarily how it happened originally. And one of the fun things, of course, for the audience is that we get to try to put all of those pieces of memory together like a puzzle, just like Sophie is. Another fun thing about this movie is the cinematography and really all of the techniques that director Charlotte Wells uses to kind of illustrate how this puzzle of memory is going to be arranged over the course of the movie. Another thing I like is that Wells has confidence in her audience. That's you and me. We aren't stupid. We can be shown and not told. Things can be left up to interpretation. Ambiguity can be involved in a movie. And in case you can't tell, I am somebody who loves this approach, and I find it increasingly rare in movies and books and shows, whatever. Finally, a movie shows and doesn't tell. It is possible to tell the story in the way you want to tell it and let the audience determine what it means to them without every little detail being dumbed down or over-explained. And in this way, podcasters like me can go on over-explaining into minute 22 of part 1 of a 6-part series on the movie. But in all seriousness, I think we have an obsession in society with quote-unquote answers. And this applies to movies, but really anything that involves art or culture in the modern digital age. Now, this is just a little theory here, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but for example, you can look at recent television shows and their finales, and the shows are often completely and entirely judged based on their finales. So remember earlier when we talked about memory and the recency effect, right? We remember the ending of things. So this may or may not be fair when talking about television shows, but again, oftentimes the finales of these shows are almost exclusively judged on how many quote-unquote plot holes get resolved and answers get given to the audience. Ambiguity and interpretation are often left by the wayside in this method of judging. And again, remember what we said about memory. We tend to remember the beginning and the end, even if that isn't fair. For example, a show like Lost is often lambasted for having a finale that doesn't give the long-awaited answers. I would argue the people doing that lambasting often have what I would consider to be a misinterpretation themselves of the show's ending, but that's a tale for another time. Contrast this with a show like Breaking Bad, where the ending of that show meticulously ties up plot holes and loose ends, and Breaking Bad's ending is often revered. Somewhere in the middle, you have a show like Mad Men, where you have a mixture of both of these approaches, and sure enough, there's a large part of the reaction to that finale where the audience doesn't really know what to do with it. And oftentimes, that gets lost in the memory of these things. So all of that is probably wandering a bit off topic, and again, not trying to oversimplify people's positive or negative reactions to those shows. There might be other reasons why they have those reactions, but I do see this idea of things being wrapped up tightly and perfectly putting the puzzle together. Oftentimes that is applauded. So when the audience is obsessed with finding plot holes in movies and having tight plots and character motivations, it's no surprise that filmmakers and authors are increasingly maybe trying to create these elaborate worlds with meticulous details where everything fits together perfectly, like a perfectly done puzzle. And when all of that comes together at the end, that's when you have this grand masterpiece. And there's only one problem with that approach. That's not how life works. There is rarely a singular moment or a singular ending where everything you've ever worked towards and everything everyone in your immediate circle has ever worked towards all comes together magically to produce a moment that is cathartic for everybody. That's especially not how memory works. So in a movie about memory, it's nice when the internal logic of the movie fits the theme. Instead of combing the depths of the unconscious mind to quote-unquote find the memory and quote-unquote unlock the story, instead we get a lot of murky ambiguity. In Aftersun, one of the things you'll probably notice as you watch is that shadows and reflections are used in the film constantly. Sophie is watching the camcorder as Callum is watching her. The audience is looking at the characters being reflected in the surface of a mirror or a TV screen, or we look at characters through the reflection of water or through the surface of a pool. Glass doors are left open or closed, and characters are viewed through these different portals. All of these are ways that the movie isn't just telling you what's happening, it's showing you and it's absorbing you into this murky puzzle of memory. Just like memory, things are hazy. They're tough to make out, a shadow without an object. So in the movie, just like in real life memory, it is these little moments that take on outsized significance. A glance, a feeling or an emotion, body language, a subtle word here and there, all of that tells a story. And as we watch the movie, it is these subtle little things that take on outsized significance. The books on the shelf that Callum is reading, the number of empty beer glasses on the table at dinner, a change in facial expression as a question is asked. So I've spent a lot of time here introducing this idea of the puzzle of memory, because I think it should be the lens or the shadow or the reflection that we view this movie through. We'll get into all of this, of course, in the next 5 episodes of this series, but when we talk about some of the plot lines and some of the other themes of the movie, they are all taking place in the context of Sophie's memory and the context of her trying to put this puzzle together of her dad on this trip. So as we get into her coming of age journey or themes of mental health, depression, suicide, what it means to have emotions and feelings, financial burdens and weights and what that does to people, vulnerability, ambiguity, self-destruct mechanisms, and really all of these topics. There's really so much going on in this movie. I think it's important to remember that memory is the overarching theme that allows these different puzzle pieces to fit or not fit together. Memory is the context of our lives.